I get more and more concerned about the economic disaster that I think awaits this country. And people say, well, what have we been through? Yeah, you're right. We've been through a lot already. But I grow more and more concerned that the Biden administration and the Fed are in the transitory, out-of-touch mode still, as they've been wrong about all of this since it started, even going back into the Trump administration when rates were kept at effectively zero, as everything was skyrocketing. We should have been getting off of zero. We weren't. The Fed was out of touch then, too. But I'm concerned now because what we're seeing is a contraction in the M2 money supply. Huh? What, Damon? The M2 money supply. Have you heard too much talk about this?
No.
Probably not.
Can you explain what the
M2 money supply represents basically the total amount of money in circulation in the U.S. economy. Cash, checkings, savings deposits, other liquid assets. And, of course, the Fed has the authority to influence that because the Fed can put some extra zeros in the create money. And, of course, they can take liquidity out of the M2 money supply, which we haven't seen in, about a century. If you look at the M2 money supply chart, it's basically up and to the right forever until recently. Now, there's many ways the Fed can reduce the money supply, and they can do it through banks, changing the requirement on what banks have to hold in this fractional reserve banking that we have. The certain percentage, they can up that, which means banks can't lend out. They can lend out less money than they could before. They increase the requirement, obviously. Then it reduces the amount of money the banks can lend out. Another way the Fed can reduce the money supply is through buying government securities from banks, which in turn reduces the amount of money banks have available to lend. And then the Fed can raise interest rates, which is the third way, which is what we've seen this year, the past 15 months, more than we have seen before. And what we've now seen is a contraction in the money supply for the first time in just about a century. And it did it again, we learned today now in March. And it is a massive economic warning of what is to come when you look at the contraction of the money supply. This hasn't happened in 90 years. I want you to understand that. You're talking about the Great Depression time, major banking crisis. These are the things that come along. And what are we starting to see now?
Right.
You're starting to see banks. Look at First Republic now. That's clearly going into receivership with the government, if not tomorrow, one of these next couple of days.
I predict Friday afternoon, just in time for the weekend so nobody notices.
Yeah, well, people are going to notice because when your balance sheet is that out of whack, people are going to notice. And the contraction of the money supply, I would venture to guess, if you look at their books, is probably one of the factors. I don't know how big a factor, but I'll bet it's not a small factor in part of what their problem is. And again, when you talk about this contraction, we have not seen this since the days of the Great Depression, 1921, 1930s. That's what we're talking about here. And when you look at previous times back then, unemployment north of 10%. Massive bank failures. This is what we're talking about coming as the Fed continues to try to suck money out of the system through quantitative tightening. At a time where banks already have a credit crunch, where you have mortgage rates already above 7%, where you have lending getting taken in, banks saying, no, we got to tighten up on the lending.
Right.
Businesses who can't get lending can't make it through times of high inflation, of possible recession. The Philly manufacturing Fed index, I believe, just lowered from only about 2 weeks ago. Their GDP prediction was 2.5. As of today, it's now down to 1.5. You look at First Republic, their deposits were down 36% year over year. Their loans were up 23% year over year. That's why they're in the position they're in. That's not sustainable. So now what would First Republic have to do? They have to cut severely back on their loan portfolio to try to bring those two things back into balance. Given the raise in interest rates, given their investment in these long-term securities, all debt that's issued has maturity dates. So when you're QTing like this that we're seeing now, and you have a contraction of the M2 money supply, and you have debt that comes of age, that matures, I mean, it's just a disaster. It's a disaster for so many things. Mortgages, business loans, just the overall money in the economy. We have inflation because there's too much money chasing too few goods. Well, pretty soon, all of a sudden, then you have the reverse. I told you we printed 40% of all dollars in existence in 2 years. That's the problem.
Right. So how do you claw that back? But you can't
raise 500 basis points and QT like this at the same time without literally driving this economy off a cliff and into the side of the mountain, which is what my fear is, and this is why I'm bringing this up. You're talking about massive layoffs. You're talking about massive bankruptcies. And that is my fear for what is coming, and it's going to affect each and every one of you. And to me, the Fed is just totally out to lunch on these facts. I heard today someone said the Fed, they don't want to look at the M2 money supply as any kind of a factor in their decision-making. He says on an annual average basis, the M2 money supply is currently declining at the fastest rate since 1933. Furthermore, the pace of the decline is increasing. Over the past 3 months, M2 has declined at an annualized rate of over 8%, not since the Great Depression, as the Fed raised interest rates while the M2 money supply was declining. And remember something, inflation is still a problem. It's not like inflation is back at 2%. Inflation is still an issue at 5.5%. Since the Great Depression, there's a very good reason that policymakers have generally sought to avoid declines in the money supply. They encourage a deflationary bust. In a fractional reserve system like our banking system, economic growth is artificially stimulated via credit creation, debt creation, which expands the money supply and boosts nominal GDP. This helps to encourage further debt accumulation as an expansion of the money supply promotes inflation, which erodes the real value of the debt. In order to further encourage debt accumulation, interest rates tend to fall over time to reduce the cost of that debt. Though with lower interest rate policy being pursued for decades, the level of leverage that exists within our system today is at an extreme level. This makes the Fed's huge pivot to much tighter monetary policy extremely risky. For just as QE and ZIRP encourage more debt accumulation and thus more leverage, QT, tightening, and drastically higher interest rates like we have now, instead encourage deleveraging. For a fractional reserve system and an economy that has relied on decades of lower rates and increased debt to artificially drive economic growth, cutting off money supply growth is akin to starving the economy. As opposed to high inflation, a declining M2 money supply instead means that the greater risk that lies ahead is a deflationary bust, as Kathy Wood has been talking about, by the way. Just as the historical record is clear on what happens when M2 is artificially increased by large amounts, it encourages a temporary economic boom and a surge in nominal GDP. The historical record is also clear on what happens when the M2 falls. It generally coincides with depressions and busts. This includes the Long Depression, 1873 to 79, the Panic of 1893, 1896, 1907, and the Depression of the 1920-21, and the Great Depression of 29 through 39. While these crises, and particularly the Great Depression, awakened many to the dangers of a contraction in the M2 money supply, and the high inflation of the 70s and 80s led to a wide recognition of the dangers of artificially increasing M2. It causes high inflation. Those lessons have been largely forgotten today. As a result, just as the Fed failed to adequately respond to a surging M2 money supply and kept ZIRP and QE running far too long, it is today repeating the same mistakes in reverse. For by failing to acknowledge the importance of today's decline in M2, the Fed is drastically over-tightening monetary policy, greatly increasing the odds of a future deflationary bust. The U.S. economy faces a dangerous period ahead.